The morning was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that cut through the thin fabric of a coat and seeped straight into the bones. The small frontier town of Redstone was still cloaked in the gray haze of dawn, its wooden buildings creaking in the wind as if protesting the harshness of life outside. Clara huddled against the wall of the general store, her fingers stiff and raw from the early frost. Her stomach ached, and her mind was filled with a single, desperate thought: her younger siblings. Tiny faces pressed against the thin blanket she had managed to gather, their hollow eyes reflecting hunger and fear. She would not, let them go hungry another day. The temptation had not been hard to find. Loaves of bread, fresh from the bakery oven the night before, sat in neat rows on the counter, their golden crusts promising warmth and sustenance. Clara had tried to bargain with the baker, offering whatever coin she had, just a few copper pennies. But the man's patience had long worn thin, his eyes hard and judgmental. "This is business, girl," he had said. "Nothing personal. You take without paying, and the law will see you punished." Her hand shook as she snatched a loaf, tucking it under her tattered shawl. It was a small act, yet to her it carried the weight of life and death. Every step back to the narrow, snow-dusted street was a battle against the fear that someone would see her, that the town's harsh eyes would judge her and condemn her before she could return to her family. But fate, or perhaps misfortune, had other plans. A shout rang out from the street corner, sharp and accusing. "Thief, stop her!" Clara froze, heart pounding like a drum in her chest. She had hoped to be invisible, to slip through the town unnoticed, but Redstone's people were quick to spot any misstep. Men and women spilled into the street, forming a human barrier as they closed in. Clara tried to plead, to explain, but her voice was drowned in the chorus of indignation. By the time the sheriff arrived, the crowd had already surrounded her. Clara's small frame was no match for their anger, and soon rough hands seized her arms. Her protests were ignored. The law was not designed to weigh intention against action. In Redstone, stealing regardless of reason demanded punishment. The sheriff, a stern man with a face weathered by years of frontier justice, read her the charges aloud. The words cut through the cold air like a blade: theft, dishonor, and public humiliation. Clara's mind raced. She thought of her siblings, alone and waiting at the small cabin on the outskirts of town. Would they survive until someone could bring them food? Could they endure another day of hunger without succumbing to despair? She swallowed the lump rising in her throat, tears threatening to spill over. Around her, the crowd muttered in judgment, some faces hard and unyielding, others soft with a fleeting, helpless sympathy that did nothing to save her. By mid-morning she was led to the town square. A crude gallows stood there, erected as a warning to all who might consider breaking the law. Clara's eyes, wide with fear, took in the scene, the ropes, the spectators, the pitiless judges of the town. She knew what awaited her. Yet, despite the terror, a spark of defiance flickered within her. She had acted out of love, not malice, and in her heart she hoped that anyone might see that and intervene before it was too late. As the rope was looped around her wrists, the cold biting into her skin, Clara's mind clung to one thought: her family. No matter what came next, she had acted for them. And in that frozen moment, suspended between fear and hope, the stage was set for a rescue that would change the course of her life forever. The town square of Redstone was alive with murmurs and whispers, though the chill in the air made the crowd stiff and shivering. Clara's small frame hung awkwardly from the rough-hewn rope, the coarse fibers biting into her wrists. Every breath felt like fire in her lungs, every shiver a reminder of the vulnerability of her position. She glanced down at the gathering crowd, a sea of faces blurred with a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and cruel amusement. Some cheered the punishment, satisfied that the law would be enforced. Others averted their eyes, their conscience pricked by the sight of a young woman suspended before them, punished for an act born out of desperation. Clara's heart thumped violently in her chest. She tried to steady her breathing, but the cold made it uneven, ragged, and visible to all who were watching. She thought of her siblings, huddled together in the tiny cabin, likely waiting for her return with empty hands and empty stomachs. The guilt weighed heavily on her. They were suffering because she had tried, in her way, to save them. Her fingers trembled as they clutched the rope, each knot pressing into her raw skin. The shame of being seen in this state, the helplessness, the fear, the very public condemnation burned deeper than the cold ever could. Around her, the townspeople offered a chorus of judgment. "Let her swing!" shouted a grizzled man, his voice filled with years of hard labor and adherence to law. This is how thieves learn. A few women whispered among themselves, some pitying, some angry. One elderly matron shook her head, muttering about how children these days had no respect for property or authority. Yet even in that disapproving whisper, there was a trace of compassion. The moral compass of the crowd was divided, torn between upholding justice and feeling the tug of empathy. The sheriff, a stern and immovable man, stood nearby with his arms crossed. He had read the law, interpreted it without leniency, and now oversaw its execution. His eyes met Clara's for a brief moment, cold and unfeeling, reinforcing the knowledge that the law, in Redstone, was indifferent to circumstance. Clara could feel the gaze of the entire town pressing down on her, suffocating and unrelenting. Clara struggled against the rope, not to escape, but instinctively, a reflex born of terror and hope. Every movement caused a rough scrape against the wood of the gallows and the fibers of the rope, leaving red marks on her delicate skin. Her thoughts raced. Perhaps someone would intervene. Perhaps someone would understand the desperation that drove her to this act. She tried to make her story visible in her eyes, to convey the truth of her situation without words, to appeal to the humanity buried in the crowd before her. Some townsfolk murmured among themselves, the whispers growing louder with speculation and debate. "She had no choice," a young man said quietly, though his voice was barely audible over the general clamor. Another shook his head, arguing that laws were not made for compassion. The tension between morality and legality created a charged atmosphere that seemed to thrum in the air like a living thing, pressing on Clara from all sides. The cold was unrelenting. Her breath came in sharp, visible puffs, and her body shivered violently despite her attempts to maintain composure. Time stretched unbearably, each second punctuated by the crowd's judgment and the silent hope that some unexpected mercy might arrive. Every moment was a struggle, not just against the rope or the chill, but against despair itself. Clara's resolve hardened. She would survive this, not only for herself but for her siblings. And in that resolve, faint yet stubborn, was the seed of the life-changing intervention that would soon arrive, altering the fate of a young woman who had dared to act out of love. The sun had barely risen over the jagged horizon, casting a pale, cold light across Redstone, when the sound of hooves echoed against the wooden boardwalks. Townspeople turned instinctively, some with curiosity, some with suspicion. Out of the gray morning haze came a figure on horseback, a man riding alone, tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that seemed to command the very air around him. His coat was worn but well-maintained, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing sharp, discerning eyes. This was Ethan, a widowed rancher whose name had traveled through whispers and rumor long before he had ever appeared in town. Ethan's arrival was quiet yet impossible to ignore. The clatter of his horse's hooves against the planks marked a rhythm of authority, calm yet unyielding. He slowed as he approached the square, his eyes sweeping over the gathered townsfolk, taking in their tense faces, the gallows, and finally, the figure suspended in midair. Clara's small, trembling form caught his attention immediately. Her pale cheeks, streaked with tears and frost, and the desperation etched into her eyes struck a chord deep within him. Ethan had seen suffering before, had witnessed hardship etched into the faces of those who labored endlessly only to scrape by. But something about this scene, and innocent, forced into punishment for a crime born of necessity, ignited a fire of indignation he could not ignore. The crowd murmured, noticing the stranger, speculating on his intent. Few in Redstone had ever seen Ethan in person. Tales of his wealth, his independence, and his quiet acts of generosity traveled faster than the man himself. Yet here he was, calm, deliberate, and observant, approaching a scene that most would shy away from. Ethan's reputation was that of a man who acted on principle, someone unafraid of standing alone against the tides of gossip, tradition, or law when morality demanded it. As he dismounted with ease, the townsfolk felt a subtle shift in the air. Ethan's presence seemed to ripple across the square, unspoken authority emanating from his calm posture. He walked with measured steps toward the gallows, his eyes never leaving Clara. For a brief moment, he paused, assessing the scene. The sheriff's rigid stance, the tense crowd, the rough-hewn ropes, and Clara's small body swaying slightly in the cold wind. His jaw tightened, a quiet resolve forming in his mind. This was not just about a woman accused of theft, it was about justice tempered with mercy, about humanity in a place often ruled by cruelty. Clara, suspended above the ground, caught sight of the approaching figure. She blinked against the morning light, unsure if her weary eyes were deceiving her. Could this man be here to help, or was he another observer, another critic? But there was something in his stride, in the assured way he moved through the crowd without fear, that offered the faintest glimmer of hope. Her heart, heavy with anxiety, skipped a beat. The sheriff noticed Ethan too, narrowing his eyes as he evaluated the newcomer. Rumors of the rancher's independent streak reached even him, but he had not expected such a direct confrontation. Ethan stopped a few feet from the gallows, his gaze steady, unflinching, and fixed on Clara. He did not speak immediately, only observed, reading the situation like a man surveying a storm. Every detail mattered, the tension in the rope, the shivering of Clara's limbs, the posture of the sheriff, and the crowd's restless anticipation. In that moment, the town of Redstone seemed to hold its collective breath. The arrival of this widowed rancher, a man known for his quiet strength and moral fortitude, set the stage for what was about to come. A choice between blind adherence to law and the intervention of compassion, a single act that could change the fate of a young woman suspended above the judgment of a whole town. The tension in the town square was palpable. Whispers of speculation and murmured judgments rippled through the crowd. But all attention had now shifted to the tall figure approaching the gallows. Ethan, the widowed rancher, moved with calm precision, his eyes locked on Clara's suspended form. Every step was deliberate, measured, as if he were considering the weight of not just the rope in front of him, but the moral weight of the entire town's expectations. The cold wind tugged at his coat, yet he seemed impervious to it, focused solely on the girl who hung precariously, a victim of circumstance and a society too quick to punish. Clara's eyes widened as she noticed the man's approach. Her heart fluttered with a mixture of hope and fear. Could this stranger truly intervene, or was he merely another observer, another man who would judge her from the sidelines? The rope cut into her wrists with every small sway, her muscles protesting, and the bitter sting of frost against her skin made it almost unbearable. She inhaled sharply, bracing herself for whatever might come next, her gaze fixed on Ethan as he reached the base of the gallows. He stopped, just a few feet away from the sheriff, who now regarded him with a mixture of suspicion and restrained irritation. "And who might you be?" the sheriff demanded, his voice sharp, carrying the authority of law and the expectation that no one should interfere. Ethan's reply was calm, his voice carrying across the square, steady and unflinching. "I am a man who believes mercy must sometimes temper justice," he said simply. The statement was enough to draw a murmur from the crowd, some shocked, some intrigued, others skeptical of his audacity. Without waiting for further debate, Ethan reached into the folds of his coat and produced a sturdy knife. With careful hands, he climbed the rough steps of the gallows, moving closer to the rope that held Clara in midair. Each movement was deliberate, confident, and yet gentle, a balance of authority and empathy. The townsfolk held their breath, some gripping their hats or murmuring prayers. The sheriff's face darkened, his authority being quietly challenged, yet Ethan paid no heed to the glare. Clara's eyes widened in disbelief as he approached. "Wait, what are you?" she began. But the words caught in her throat as Ethan swiftly, yet carefully, cut the rope. She fell into his arms, her body weak and trembling, a mix of exhaustion, cold, and relief washing over her. The crowd gasped collectively, stunned by the audacity of the act. For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by the faint crackle of frost underfoot and the distant wind through the town's buildings. Ethan held her securely, supporting her weight. His gaze met hers, steady and reassuring. "Eat first," he said softly, almost as if speaking to a child in need of comfort, yet with the firmness of someone who understood the gravity of the situation. "We will worry about everything else afterward." "You need strength." Clara's lips trembled, a tear sliding down her cheek, not from shame but from the overwhelming relief and unexpected kindness. She had been suspended between fear and despair moments ago, and now she felt, for the first time, that hope was possible. The crowd erupted, some with outrage, some with admiration, some simply whispering in disbelief. Ethan gently set Clara down, guiding her toward the warmth of his coat and the shelter that awaited beyond the square. His actions spoke louder than any words. Here was a man who prioritized life and compassion over rigid adherence to law, a man who recognized the desperation that drove her actions. Even the sheriff, though angered and humiliated, could not immediately bring himself to speak, for Ethan's moral clarity had unsettled him. The act had done more than save a life. It had shifted the perspective of everyone who witnessed it, forcing them to confront the tension between justice and mercy, law and humanity. In that fleeting, powerful moment, Clara's life and the course of the town changed forever. The rope was cut, the punishment halted, and a simple phrase, "Eat first," became a promise of protection, care, and the possibility of redemption. The square was still buzzing with murmurs, whispers of outrage, disbelief, and cautious admiration, but Ethan's focus had already shifted. Clara, weak and trembling, was guided gently down the wooden steps of the gallows. Her legs wobbled under her own weight, and she clutched at his coat as though it were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become uncertain. Ethan's hands were steady, firm, but kind, supporting her without speaking more than necessary. Every step away from the public spectacle was a step toward safety, toward warmth, and most importantly, toward a moment where Clara could simply breathe. As they made their way out of Redstone's main street, the cold morning air still nipping at exposed skin, Clara couldn't help but glance back at the square. The townsfolk had dispersed, some shaking their heads in judgment, others quietly impressed by the rancher's courage. Yet the weight of what had just happened clung to her. Shame, fear, and gratitude mingled in an overwhelming, almost paralyzing storm. She had been rescued, yes, but by a man she barely knew, a stranger with motives she could only guess at. And in that uncertainty, a quiet war raged inside her between mistrust and relief. The ride to Ethan's ranch was silent, save for the rhythmic clatter of hooves against the snow-crusted ground. Clara's fingers unconsciously tightened around the shawl she had been wearing, the loaf of bread now safely tucked in a satchel Ethan had produced from the back of his horse. She glanced up at him occasionally, taking in the rugged features of a man whose presence exuded quiet strength and unspoken sorrow. There was a loneliness in him. She realized a shadow behind his steady eyes, as if he too had known loss and hardship. The ranch itself was a haven from the harshness of the town. Nestled against a line of snow-dusted pines and rolling hills, it was modest but well kept, a place where life's necessities had been tended to carefully despite the unforgiving land. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth and the comforting scent of cooking. Ethan led her inside without hesitation, ushering her to a rough-hewn wooden table where a simple meal awaited: fresh bread, cheese, and a steaming pot of soup. Clara's stomach rumbled audibly, and for a brief moment embarrassment flared across her face, but Ethan only smiled gently. "Eat first," he repeated, echoing the words from the gallows. And this time there was no tension, no urgency, only calm assurance. Clara hesitated, her pride battling the undeniable need for sustenance, but hunger quickly won. She broke the bread in her hands, the warmth of the food grounding her, and took the first bite as if tasting life itself. Ethan watched her carefully, not intruding, but offering silent protection. In that simple act, a bridge began to form between them, a quiet understanding that she was no longer alone. After she had eaten, they settled by the hearth, the fire casting a gentle glow over the cabin's interior. Clara wrapped herself in a blanket Ethan had provided, still trembling from both cold and residual fear. Words were difficult at first. She wasn't used to kindness without expectation or judgment. Ethan, patient as ever, allowed silence to fill the room, speaking only when necessary, letting her regain a sense of composure. In the flickering light, Clara began to observe the life around her, the traces of a man who had built a home not just for survival, but with care, order, and a quiet dignity. There were photographs of his late wife, tools neatly arranged, and signs of a life lived with responsibility and resilience. It was foreign to Clara, this environment of safety and stability, yet the warmth it offered seeped into her bones, soothing her frayed nerves. By the time evening descended and the fire had burned low, Clara realized something she hadn't dared hope for. She was safe. The rope, the gallows, the judgmental eyes of the town, they were behind her now. In their place was warmth, protection, and a strange, budding sense of trust in a man who had chosen compassion over law. She didn't yet know what the future held, but for the first time in days, she allowed herself to simply breathe and to hope. The fire crackled low in the hearth, sending flickers of orange light dancing across the walls of Ethan's cabin. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but inside, the warmth offered a fragile sense of safety that Clara clung to with both relief and suspicion. She had eaten, she had rested, and yet a tension lingered beneath her skin. The fear of being betrayed, abandoned, or judged was difficult to shake. After all, she had been caught stealing bread to feed her family not for greed, but necessity. And now, in a stranger's home, she felt the heavy weight of vulnerability pressing down on her. Ethan, seated across from her on a sturdy wooden chair, seemed almost unbothered by her hesitancy. He watched her quietly, hands folded, eyes calm yet attentive. There was no rush, no interrogation, no judgment. It was this patience that both frustrated and intrigued Clara. In Redstone, people either punished swiftly or gossiped relentlessly. No one gave her the time or space to simply exist without suspicion. Ethan's quiet demeanor was disarming, and yet Clara's instinct told her to be wary. Trust was earned, not freely given, and she had learned that lesson all too well. Tentatively, she began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "My siblings. They haven't eaten for 2 days. I couldn't let them starve." Her hands twisted the blanket in her lap. "I didn't want trouble. I only wanted them to survive." The words poured out, laden with fear, guilt, and a yearning for understanding. Clara's eyes flicked to Ethan, searching for the slightest sign of condemnation, but found none. His expression remained steady, and the gentleness in his gaze encouraged her to continue. Ethan nodded slowly. "You did what you had to do," he said. "Desperation can make us act in ways we wouldn't normally. But there's a difference between stealing to survive and stealing for greed. I see what you are." His voice was calm, yet it carried the weight of truth, a rare kind of justice that weighed circumstance as much as action. Clara felt a flicker of something unfamiliar relief, but also unease. Could someone see her act as she intended, not as the law labeled it? Hours passed with cautious conversation. Clara told him about the small cabin on the outskirts of town, about the struggles of keeping her siblings fed and clothed, about the nights she spent awake, worrying, planning, and fearing the worst. Ethan listened, offering the occasional question or quiet observation, never judgment, never impatience. Slowly, Clara realized that he was not only listening, but understanding. And yet, the smallest acts, his easy familiarity, the way he moved through his home as if she were safe there, made her uneasy. Trust was difficult for her. Years of hardship and fear had taught her that dependence could be dangerous. Ethan, sensing her hesitation, allowed the silence to stretch comfortably, as if the pause itself were a form of reassurance. "You don't have to speak more than you want," he said softly. "No one here is going to force you. You can take your time." The simplicity of his words, their respect for her agency, began to chip away at the walls she had built around her heart. Trust, she realized, would not come instantly, but perhaps slowly, with patience and care. By nightfall, Clara was sitting a little straighter, her hands less clenched, her gaze less guarded. She still felt fear, but it was tempered with a strange sensation of safety. The warmth of the fire, the quiet presence of Ethan, and the security of a roof over her head began to weave a fragile tapestry of trust. She wasn't entirely ready to let go of suspicion, but for the first time in days, perhaps weeks, she allowed herself to feel hope not only for her siblings, but for herself. In the quiet of the cabin, trust was beginning to bloom, not fully, not yet, but in small, deliberate moments, in shared silences, in patient listening, and in the simple, unspoken promise that she was not alone. And that, for Clara, was enough to take the first tentative step toward a future that might, finally, hold more than fear. The morning sun had barely broken through the gray skies when a group of townspeople arrived at Ethan's ranch. Their boots crunched over the frost-hardened ground, and the scent of anger and indignation seemed to precede them. Clara, who had been slowly regaining her composure, froze when she heard the shouting in the distance. Panic surged through her as the reality of the town's disapproval came crashing back. They had not forgotten her crime, and now they had tracked her down to the one place she felt safe. Ethan stepped forward, positioning himself between Clara and the approaching crowd. His presence alone radiated authority and confidence, yet his calm demeanor was underpinned by readiness. The townspeople, a mix of merchants, laborers, and the sheriff himself, halted a few feet away, their faces flushed with anger and frustration. "Rancher," the sheriff called, his voice cutting through the cold air. "You dare harbor a thief?" You interfere with the law of Redstone, and you will answer for it." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She clutched the edge of the blanket Ethan had given her, uncertain whether to speak or stay silent. She had expected judgment in town, perhaps even punishment, but she had not anticipated it following her here. The fear of being torn from the sanctuary Ethan had provided made her stomach knot with dread. Ethan's gaze swept over the group, steady and unwavering. "She stole out of necessity," he said firmly. "You all know the situation. She fed her starving siblings, and yet you would see her punished for acting out of love?" His voice carried the weight of conviction, challenging their rigid adherence to law without cruelty. The crowd murmured, some shifting uncomfortably, others bristling at his defiance. One of the merchants stepped forward, shaking a finger at Ethan. "You cannot just ignore the law. If we let this go, everyone will think they can take what they need without consequence." A few others nodded, their faces stern. Yet even as they spoke, there was an undercurrent of doubt, a hesitation sparked by Ethan's unwavering stance. His words planted a seed of thought they had not allowed themselves before. Perhaps justice needed balance, and perhaps mercy had a place in Redstone. Clara watched Ethan carefully, her fear slowly giving way to awe. He was not just protecting her body, he was protecting her dignity, standing firm against a town that had been quick to judge and condemn. In that moment, she realized that he understood her in ways she had not imagined possible. His actions were not just about defiance. They were about principle, courage, and a moral code that transcended rigid rules. The confrontation intensified as the sheriff's face reddened with frustration. "You'll answer for this, Ethan," he barked. "This is interference. This is chaos." Ethan met the sheriff's glare without flinching. "I answered to the law, yes," he replied evenly, "but the law is meant to serve justice, not punish the innocent for acts of necessity. I will not let fear or rigid rule dictate morality here." Some of the townspeople shifted uncomfortably, whispers spreading like wildfire. Ethan's words had planted doubt in their minds, forcing them to question their own harsh judgments. Clara, sensing a shift, felt a faint spark of hope. Perhaps this confrontation would not end in punishment, but in understanding. After a tense moment, Ethan gestured toward the cabin. "She will stay here, safe and fed. That is not a crime, it is humanity. If you want to challenge me, do so fairly, but I will not abandon what is right for the sake of tradition or fear." Slowly the crowd began to disperse, some muttering complaints, others deep in thought. The sheriff lingered, but even he seemed forced to reconsider the rigid stance he had carried into this morning. Clara exhaled, her body relaxing slightly. For the first time, she felt that perhaps she might survive not only physically, but with her dignity intact, and perhaps even with the beginnings of respect from the town. In the quiet that followed, Clara looked at Ethan with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. He had faced the town, stood firm against their anger, and ensured her safety. More than that, he had shown her the first glimmer of hope that courage and morality could exist, even in a place hardened by fear and judgment. The first hint of danger came in the form of smoke rising from the distant tree line. Clara noticed it first, her sharp instincts honed by weeks of worry for her siblings. She pointed toward the horizon, voice trembling. "Fire in the forest near the cabin." Her words hung in the cold morning air, and for a moment, Ethan's calm gaze hardened with immediate concern. Without a word, he grabbed his coat and keys to the horses, signaling Clara to follow. Despite the lingering fear from the town's confrontation, Clara did not hesitate. She knew her siblings were in danger, and that time was critical. Ethan moved with practiced efficiency, his years of experience as a rancher evident in every action. They mounted their horses, the animals sensing urgency, and rode swiftly across the frost-crusted fields toward the smoke that darkened the sky. The wind carried the acrid scent of burning wood, stinging their eyes and throats as the situation became more apparent. As they approached the cabin, Clara's heart clenched. Flames licked the edges of the roof, smoke curling upward in thick black tendrils. Her siblings were visible through the small windows, trapped and panicking. Without hesitation, Ethan dismounted and vaulted over the porch railing with agility and strength born of years working the land. Clara followed, adrenaline sharpening her senses despite the fear coursing through her veins. Ethan assessed the situation in an instant. The fire had spread rapidly, fueled by dry wood and frost-hardened brush, and if they didn't act quickly, the cabin would be lost, and with it, the few belongings and safety the children depended on. He instructed Clara calmly but firmly, "Open the side window and get them out, one by one. I'll cover you." His voice was a tether in the chaos, steady and commanding. Clara's hand shook as she followed his instructions. Her first sibling, a small boy with wide, terrified eyes, was lifted through the window with Ethan's assistance. The fire crackled closer, heat brushing her skin, yet fear was balanced by the knowledge that they were not alone. Ethan moved with calculated precision, carrying the youngest sibling, shielding them from falling debris, and guiding them toward safety. Every action he took was deliberate, protective, and filled with a quiet bravery that Clara had begun to admire from afar. Minutes felt like hours, yet finally, all the children were outside, coughing but unharmed. Clara sank to the ground, her chest heaving, and looked at Ethan. He, too, was breathing heavily, soot and ash dusting his coat, but his eyes held the same steady calm that had guided them through the danger. For the first time, Clara fully recognized the depth of his courage, not just in the act of saving her from the gallows, but in the way he risked life and limb for her family without hesitation. The fire, now partially under control with Ethan's quick thinking and the aid of water from the nearby stream, was burning itself out. Neighbors who had arrived to watch or criticize moments earlier now stood at a distance, witnessing a different kind of law, one governed by action, bravery, and compassion rather than rules or fear. Clara, holding her siblings close, realized that the events of the day had shifted everything. Danger had forced them to act as a unit, highlighting trust, reliance, and courage in a way that words never could. As the smoke cleared and the threat subsided, Clara felt a newfound bond with Ethan. He had saved her once from public punishment, and now he had saved her family from imminent destruction. She understood that trust, once fragile, could be tested and strengthened in moments of crisis. Standing in the fading light, surrounded by soot, ash, and the lingering scent of fire, Clara allowed herself to feel something she had not dared in weeks: relief, gratitude, and the stirring beginnings of admiration, perhaps even affection, for the man who had become their protector. The fire had changed more than the cabin. It had changed Clara's perception of safety, courage, and the possibilities of human kindness in a harsh world. In that turning point, both she and Ethan realized that together they could face not only danger, but the harsh judgments and challenges of life on the frontier. Word of the fire and Ethan's daring rescue spread through Redstone like wildfire. By the next morning, the townspeople who had so readily condemned Clara found themselves whispering, debating, and reconsidering the story they thought they knew. The once rigid lines between law and morality began to blur in their minds. Clara, a young woman previously labeled a thief, was now seen as a courageous sister who risked everything to protect her siblings and whose life had been saved by a man who dared to challenge convention. The sheriff, still uneasy, watched as townspeople approached the ranch cautiously. Some came with curiosity, others with lingering judgment, and a few with the humility that only witnessing true bravery can inspire. Ethan met each visitor with calm confidence, not arrogance, and spoke plainly about what had occurred. She acted out of necessity, not malice, he explained. She fed her family when no one else would help. That is not a crime of character, it is a reflection of survival. His words carried weight, grounded in authority, honesty, and moral clarity, and slowly they began to resonate. Clara remained in the background, her siblings playing quietly nearby, yet she could feel the shift in energy. People were no longer speaking over her, they were speaking around her, acknowledging her story without immediate judgment. The merchants who had argued for punishment now found themselves nodding, their hardened expressions softening. Even the sheriff, whose authority had been challenged, seemed to struggle with his own rigidity. He could not openly commend Ethan, but he could no longer deny the courage, skill, and humanity on display. A group of women approached Clara cautiously, their eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. "You've been through so much," one said softly. "We judged you too quickly." "Perhaps we were wrong." Clara, hesitant at first, allowed herself a faint smile. The simple acknowledgment of her struggle, the willingness of others to see her humanity, was an unfamiliar but welcome comfort. For the first time in weeks, she felt the warmth of community rather than its cold judgment. Ethan continued to act as both protector and mediator, ensuring that no one crossed the line between curiosity and intrusion. He guided conversations gently, allowing Clara to share her story in her own words. Her voice, once tentative and fearful, grew stronger with each telling. She spoke of hunger, desperation, and love for her siblings, and of the terror she felt facing the gallows. The townspeople listened, some openly moved, some silently reconsidering their assumptions. By midday, a subtle but powerful shift had occurred. Redstone, a town once quick to judge and slow to forgive, began to embrace the notion that justice must include compassion. Children who had overheard the stories of Clara's bravery now looked at her with admiration rather than disdain. Merchants who had scoffed at her theft began offering small acts of aid, food, supplies, and promises to help her family. Even the sheriff, while maintaining the law formally, allowed for discretion in cases like Clara's, a concession that marked a quiet victory for humanity over rigid rule. Clara's siblings, now safe and fed, played freely under Ethan's watchful eye. Clara herself felt a quiet sense of triumph, not just for surviving the gallows or the fire, but for reclaiming her place within the community. The redemption she had longed for, acceptance, understanding, and a chance at dignity, was slowly unfolding before her eyes. By evening, the town square had changed in subtle ways. Conversations carried an undercurrent of empathy, neighbors checking on one another more carefully, parents speaking to children about kindness and understanding rather than fear. The actions of one man, the widowed rancher, had sparked a transformation that rippled outward, touching even those least willing to admit their own previous harshness. Clara realized that her story was no longer solely about fear, punishment, or survival. It had become a lesson in courage, morality, and the power of human compassion. Through Ethan's intervention, the town had glimpsed a different way to balance law and mercy. And in that shift, Clara found not only safety but a tentative sense of belonging. For the first time, she imagined a future not defined by shame, but by possibility. The chill of early morning had softened into a gentle, golden light as Clara walked alongside Ethan on the ranch, her siblings trailing happily behind. The fire from weeks before was now a distant memory, replaced by the warmth of stability and the quiet rhythm of life reclaimed. Clara felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a burden of fear and shame that had hung over her since the day she stole the bread. In its place was a sense of possibility, a fragile but undeniable hope that life could be more than survival, more than judgment, more than punishment. Ethan had become more than a rescuer. He was a guardian, a guide, and slowly a friend. Their bond had been forged in moments of extreme danger and quiet trust. tested in the gallows, the fire, and the moral confrontation with the town. Clara had learned to rely on him, not blindly, but with cautious faith, recognizing that courage could take many forms, sometimes in daring rescue, sometimes in quiet patience, and sometimes in simple acts of care. The ranch itself was a place of healing. The small cabin, once the setting of whispered tension and whispered fear, now felt like a sanctuary. Scented by the wood smoke from the hearth, filled with the laughter of children, and marked by the steady rhythm of work and life, it became a symbol of the new beginning for Clara and her siblings. She had learned to find joy in small things: a loaf of bread, a clean blanket, a warm hearth. Yet the larger gift was the sense that she belonged somewhere, that she had a place where she was safe and valued. The town of Redstone, too, had shifted. Ethan's courage and Clara's story had changed the hearts of many who once stood in judgment. Neighbors greeted them with cautious smiles and, in some cases, small offerings of help. Merchants, once rigid in their insistence on strict justice, now left food and supplies at the edge of the ranch, a quiet acknowledgment of shared humanity. Even the sheriff, still formal in his duties, showed a softer approach when dealing with matters of desperation, understanding that law and compassion must coexist. Clara found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here, from desperation to public humiliation, from the cold rope of the gallows to the warmth of Ethan's home, from fear to tentative trust. The journey had not been easy. Every step had tested her courage, humility, and capacity to trust. But she had emerged not only physically unharmed but emotionally strengthened, with a newfound understanding of compassion, resilience, and the ways in which kindness could transform even the harshest circumstances. Ethan, noticing her thoughtful silence, spoke softly. "You've done well, Clara. Your courage isn't just in surviving, it's in choosing to keep going, to protect those you love, and to trust when it's hard." Clara glanced at him, her eyes meeting his with gratitude and quiet admiration. She had come to realize that life on the frontier was unforgiving, but that within the unforgiving, acts of kindness and courage could reshape destinies. As the sun climbed higher, casting long golden rays across the rolling hills, Clara felt a sense of completion, not an ending, but a beginning. She and her siblings were safe. They were nurtured. And perhaps most importantly, they were part of a world where human kindness and courage could exist alongside law and hardship. In the days that followed, Clara and Ethan's relationship continued to grow, founded on respect, trust, and the shared experience of survival and moral courage. There was no rush, no urgency to define it in labels, only the steady, comforting presence of two people who had saved each other in different ways. The bond they shared promised more than protection. It promised partnership, hope, and the quiet possibility of love. By evening, the ranch was alive with laughter and life, a stark contrast to the fear and tension of days before. Clara looked out across the horizon, her heart light, her mind at peace, and her future open. The gallows, the rope, the town's judgment, they were behind her. Ahead lay freedom, safety, and the promise of a life defined not by fear, but by courage, compassion, and new beginnings.